As the caption indicates, this is part one of two videos on the causes of the First World War. At the end of this video, there'll be a link in YouTube that takes you directly to the next one, so please follow that. TeachersPayTeachers.com has the keynote attached, and I mention that in a second as well. And when we're teaching this, it's just always remember that when dealing with each of the different causes, it's always looking at why all that information encourages the nations to go to war. As I said, at the end of this, you'll be taken to a link to part 2. Thank you. These are the learning objectives, 3 of them going up in complexity. Just first of all, being able to describe main causes, short and long term, and then the ability to evaluate any links that exist between causes, and then finally to be able to judge the most significant cause or identify any linked cause. As I said, this is not going to look at the July crisis. Obviously we know, and most people know, that it all got kicked off really with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip, but there's a lot before that leads up to this conflict, and there is a shorter video looking at the July crisis and those months that took us to war, but this is really looking at those causes that took us that far. Straight on into the main causes. As I said, use this as a teaching tool. I'll give you any tips. The last slide you just looked at was like a walkabout talkabout, so you could just post up some blank sheets around the room and get kids to articulate what they know already, because they'll know a lot already. There's 2 kind of good essay titles here, discussing the part played in the outbreak of the First World War by 2 states, excluding Germany. Most students like to jump in with Germany, so this is good. It makes them think a little bit. And then to what extent was militarism the most significant cause of World War I? Again, encouraging students to think not only militarism but the other factors, then really do a good piece of analysis and balance on that. So I like to always do a good activity to start, and what makes a country a great power is a good exercise, because it gets kids thinking about those powerful nations that took us into the first. These are the main causes we're looking at: militarism, industrialization, the alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. I hope to do this all within about 10 minutes. Let's look at first and jump into that. The main alliance system is very familiar. We will be looking at the Balkans later, but the main one, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, France, Great Britain, and Italy, form those 2 big alliance blocks. And if we look at some of the background to the nations, often students don't know that Germany becomes a nation in 1871, and Bismarck wants to expand. Why? Proud country, has a proud history. Germany, although it was a kind of a series of monarchies and states, was very proud, very strong, and they wanted to expand to match the likes of Britain and those other countries who were imperialistic and expanding. So he starts building alliances, pledging military support around the world, and a real aim to isolate the French. The relationship between Germany and France has been tough for many years. Germany has a relationship with Russia through financial means from 1887 in the reinsurance treaty. It's all around loans and money and support, and they lose that relationship with Russia after refusing to give her loans in 1890. That gives Germany a bit of a problem, because obviously France is to the west and Russia is to the east, so potential there for a war. Russia is isolated. They don't like being isolated, but they are, and they gain support from Germany in loans, and then the French jump in with loans after that. France again are isolated, and again don't like being isolated. Not the strongest military in the world, and they want friendships to support them, particularly with the relationship they have with Germany. And they have no natural friendships, which is us to Britain. Britain loved being in isolation, and even had the term splendid isolation. Britain would come out of it when it suited her. Had a massive empire, but they just had a failed Boer War experience in Africa, where it started to become obvious that their military or their tactics maybe weren't appropriate, or their technology wasn't where it should be. They started a naval race with Germany, with the Dreadnoughts, as we'll come on to, and there was tension in Africa with France, particularly as other countries started the scramble for Africa. This is a very common picture of the alliance systems, the triple entente of Russia, France, and Britain. Entente is obviously a French word, so that's how I always remember that France is in it. France, Britain, and Russia make up that. And then the triple alliance of Italy, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. You can see in the middle there is the Balkans, and we're going to come on to that. But the 2 big alliance systems are the Entente and the triple alliance. And this is what Europe looks like in 1914. So you can see the triple alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy smack bang in the middle of Russia, France, and England. So just from a militaristic point of view, you can see that the German, Austria-Hungary, Italian alliance there is really surrounded. So without knowing anything more than that, there's a disadvantage to that. And there's a strength, obviously, by being surrounded, but by having the strength in the center there, but having to fight wars on two fronts is difficult. And then you throw into the mix the whole Balkan situation there, it becomes even more complex. So there are your two alliances. And why would alliances lead to war? It's always good to ask that question, particularly when you're answering a question about what factor led to war. So you have to look at why. An alliance is about suspicion, secrecy. They're hard to maintain. There's a tension there. If one person fights, and they have to call in their buddies. And historians Robert Roswell Palmer and Joel Colton said it would have taken the most Olympian of statesmanship to have actually avoided war. It was almost too much effort or too hard not to have a war on this. So that's how alliances led to it, that kind of increasing tension between the countries, the fact that if any one of them had had a problem with each other, they would have jumped in. Let's move on to militarism now. Militarism factor in a breakout of war for obvious reasons. And at the turn of the century, the 19th and 20th, major European powers had the largest armies in history. Statesmen believed that this would avoid war through deterrence. You can see today with the whole the mutually assured destruction idea that if you have significant weapons on both sides, then war will be avoided. I would argue that maybe that works with nuclear weapons because it's going to lead to destruction of significant infrastructure, if not the world. I don't know if that works with a smaller kind of weapons of destruction, such as cannons and machine guns, or even they were developing. They weren't even an issue in the First World War. So I don't know if it was a good, smart move, but they felt that deterrence would avoid war. A good exercise for kids is: do you think this would agree? Do you think this would actually work? And is it a dangerous game? And what could happen? And again, this growth of military creates fear, mistrust, and also preemptive strikes. So a smaller country that's getting outgrown might strike early. Huge armies, how do they come about? Besides Great Britain, the armies were fed by conscription of up to between 2 and 7 years. That's the amount of time they'd have to spend for men of age. France passed a 3-year law, which increased from 2 years, so soldiers had to serve for 3 years. And the Russian army was the largest in the world, with 1.3 million, with a reserves that some suggest about 5 million and growing. So huge armies. But there's a big, and that's called mobilisation. Mobilisation is how quickly it takes an army to actually get to a battlefield, and unless you have good infrastructure, good industrial means like railroads that can quickly transport weapons and people and soldiers and food and resources to the front line, it actually doesn't matter how big your army is. So particularly with the Russians here, their mobilisation strategy was not good. So when we're looking at size of armies, you always have to remember how quickly could they have mobilised. And if it's right in the middle of Europe, Germany's going to have an easier job of mobilising because that's where the battlefields would have been formed. Militarism, this whole why is this a factor for war? Well, the armies were increasing and navies were increasing, so it just makes everyone feel a little bit tense. The technology used by countries developed significantly and the industrial methods improved, so guns became better. Before this, the joke is, mainly wars were fought on horseback with swords. So now we're talking about weapons that can kill in vast numbers and quickly. Krupp and Skoda factories became big industrial heartlands and producing machine guns that could fire 400 to 500 rounds per minute. These are killing machines. And that's the equivalent of 80 rifles. So the game's changing, and with cannons as well, these weapons of war and death are becoming much more productive, if you like. And of course, the big one is the Dreadnoughts, the Battle of the Dreadnoughts. Began between Britain and Germany, and it became hugely contentious and created huge friction between both nations. In 1906, Britain launched the first Dreadnought, and it basically meant that all others were redundant because it had this awesome firepower. HMS Dreadnought, 17,900 tons, 526 feet, 12-inch guns, 18 4-inch guns, torpedoes. This was a game changer. It completely changed the shape of the war in terms of the navy, and you can just see, if you look at the tables, how the two countries were going backwards and forwards. And just the fact there was a race between building weapons of war creates tension, because why else would you build something unless you're going to use it? So both countries realized that in building this, they were probably going to create something that meant they had to go to war, increasing tension and increasing the problem between Germany and Britain. And you can see here, this is a great table to look at the balance of power in 1914, where things were, the number of soldiers, warships, submarines. And it's a great exercise to get students at this point just to rank the countries, like who should win on paper. Looking at this, who should win this war? Great exercise, great statistics, and it also gives students some statistical evidence to use in essays.
That brings you to the end of part one. As I mentioned earlier, the resources on teacherspayteachers.com. My username is resources for learning, and that's for the numerical 4, so resources for learning, and it's all free on there. So feel free to download it. Thanks.